In the war room beneath Geneva, Secretary General Patricia Novak addressed the assembly and told the representatives they had reached a turning point because the Krell could no longer defeat humanity quickly, but neither could humans drive the Krell from space entirely, and they faced a choice between escalation or stalemate, and the chamber was quiet as everyone absorbed the weight of her words. Representative Helen Ford stood and said they could not sustain indefinite warfare because their economy was already strained to breaking, and their people lived in constant fear of the next attack, and children were growing up knowing only military drills and rationing, and this was not the future anyone had imagined when humanity first reached for the stars. Colonel Amy Carter, who had been promoted to Director of Earth Defense Intelligence, suggested a third option, and said they should make the cost of attacking humanity greater than any potential benefit, and establish such formidable defense that the Krell would decide humans were not worth the resources to conquer, and it would not be the peace they hoped for, but it was a kind of peace. The assembly debated for weeks, and the arguments were fierce and passionate, because some representatives wanted to build more dreadnoughts and take the fight to Krell space, while others argued for defensive posture, and still others wanted to try diplomacy again despite the fate of Ambassador Morgan and his delegation, and the debate stretched through long nights and tired days. Meanwhile in space the fleets continued their eternal dance, and Krell scouts probed human defenses, and human patrols watched Krell movements, and both sides gathered intelligence and prepared for possibilities, and the Cold War among the stars settled into an uneasy routine where neither side could gain decisive advantage. Admiral Richard Cole spent the next 15 years commanding humanity's growing fleet, and he oversaw construction of 5 more dreadnoughts, bringing the total to 9, and he established defensive doctrine that would protect human space for generations, and he trained officers and developed tactics and turned Earth military from a system defense force into something that could stand against galactic powers. The Krell Dominion never launched another major offensive against human space, and neither did they sue for peace, and the two civilizations maintained an uneasy balance, with both recognizing that the cost of defeating the other exceeded any possible gain, and it was not the ending anyone wanted, but it was the ending both sides could live with. Captain Jake Morrison rose through the ranks and eventually commanded the dreadnought UES Defiant, and he patrolled the border regions and engaged Krell raiders and pirates, and kept the shipping lanes safe, and he married a woman named Claire who worked in colonial administration, and they had 2 children who grew up knowing their father was helping keep humanity safe. Lieutenant Kyle Hayes became Captain Hayes and commanded his own frigate and then a cruiser, and he served with distinction in a dozen small engagements and skirmishes that never made the history books, but were vital to maintaining the balance of power, and he retired with honors after 30 years of service. High Commander Velkrin continued to advocate for peaceful coexistence within Krell leadership, and his faction slowly gained influence as the years passed, and younger Krell commanders looked at the costs of their attempted conquest of humanity, and questioned whether expansion was worth such losses, and gradually the Dominion shifted toward defensive consolidation rather than aggressive expansion. On New Perth the colony rebuilt and grew, and the memorial for the vigilant crew became a place where children learned about the day their world almost fell, and how a handful of ships stood against impossible odds to buy time for evacuation, and the colony transformed from farming community into a thriving military and commercial hub that served as guardian of the Arcturus sector. 20 years after the Battle of New Perth, historian Nathan Cross published his definitive work titled The First Galactic War, and he wrote that the battle marked the moment humanity ceased being explorers and became warriors, and Admiral Cole. Dreadnoughts did not win peace but won something more valuable, which was time, and time to build and time to learn and time to transform from a young species into a power that could not be ignored or destroyed. Cross wrote that the Krell Dominion and humanity maintained uneasy balance for decades, with neither able to defeat the other without catastrophic cost. And eventually this Cold War became accepted reality, and trade began cautiously, and cultural exchanges happened slowly, and the two civilizations learned to coexist if not cooperate. And it was not friendship, but it was survival, and ultimately survival was victory enough. Admiral Cole retired at 67, leaving behind a fleet of 9 dreadnoughts and defensive doctrine that protected humanity for generations, and he spent his final years on a small farm on Earth, tending crops and refusing interview requests and living quietly with his wife and grandchildren. When a persistent journalist asked why Cole declined to discuss his legacy, the admiral smiled and said he built weapons so humanity could survive, and now it was time for someone else to build the peace, and he wanted no part of fame or glory and just wanted to live his remaining years in quiet satisfaction, knowing he had done his duty. Cole died at 82, surrounded by family, and the entire human fleet powered down their main reactors for 60 seconds in salute, and even the Krell in their own way acknowledged his passing, and their warships withdrew from human space for 3 days as gesture of respect between ancient enemies. The galaxy had learned an important lesson, and that lesson was that humanity would fight for survival with everything they possessed. And in the cold mathematics of galactic power, sometimes the willingness to fight was more important than the capacity to win. And humanity had demonstrated both qualities in measure that could not be ignored. The border between human space and Krell territory became known as the Coal Line, and it remained stable for 50 years and then 100 years, and eventually it was simply accepted as natural boundary. And younger generations on both sides grew up knowing the line existed, but not remembering the blood that defined it. Trade routes developed along the border, and cultural exchanges increased, and human scholars studied Krell history, while Krell scientists examined human technology, and mutual understanding grew slowly like a tree growing from scorched earth, and it would take generations, but eventually the possibility of genuine peace emerged from the ashes of war. The Thunderchild was preserved as a museum ship and orbited Earth as a reminder of what humanity could build when threatened, and school children toured its corridors and stood on the bridge where Admiral Cole had given orders that saved millions of lives, and they learned that freedom required eternal vigilance and that peace was not the absence of conflict, but the willingness to defend what mattered. New Perth Station expanded into a major hub, and the colony population grew to 10 million, and people came from across human space to see the place where humanity made its stand, and the observation deck where Captain Morrison watched the Krell. Fleet Approach became a historical landmark, and visitors stood where he stood and imagined facing impossible odds with courage and determination. The memorial for the vigilant crew bore a simple inscription that read, "They were ready to give everything so others could have tomorrow," and it became tradition for graduating military officers to visit the memorial before their first assignments and place their hand on the stone and remember that service meant sacrifice. The stars belonged to no one, but humanity had earned its place among them through blood and courage, and the willingness to stand firm when retreat would have been easier, and the galaxy was vast and full of wonders and dangers, but humanity had proven they belonged here, and they would not be driven away, and they would not surrender, and that made all the difference in the end. 6 months after the Battle of New Perth, the political landscape of human space had transformed completely, and what the media called the Thunderchild effect rippled through every colony and station and settlement that humanity had established among the stars, and Admiral Richard Cole stood on the bridge of the UES Avalanche, which was humanity's second Dreadnought, and the ship had been completed in record time, using the Thunderchild as a template, but incorporating lessons learned from the Krell engagement. Commander Vincent Park, who had transferred to the Avalanche as Cole Permanent Tactical Officer, reported that the construction yards were sending final status updates, and Dreadnought's Maelstrom and Tempest were at 70% completion with expected operational status in 3 months, and Cole nodded, because 4 Dreadnoughts were not the 6 he had requested, but it was enough to establish defensive perimeter around humanity core systems. The political cost had been enormous, and 3 colonial governments had collapsed under economic strain, and 2 colony worlds had declared independence rather than contribute to the military buildup, and Luna and Mars were operating under emergency rationing protocols, but they were alive and they would stay that way. And that was what mattered in the end. Lieutenant Danny Morris from Communications announced that Secretary General Novak was requesting a priority channel, and Cole told him to put her through, and Novak hologram materialized beside the command chair, and she looked exhausted and aged. 10 years and 6 months, because the stress of managing humanity transformation into a military power was consuming her. Novak told Cole she had news from their diplomatic corps, and the Krell had responded to their peace overture, and Cole felt a chill run through him because 3 months ago, against his strong objections, the Assembly had authorized a diplomatic mission to Krell space, and the delegation led by Ambassador Frank Morgan had been tasked with finding peaceful resolution to the conflict. Cole asked what the Krell had said, and Novak's expression told him everything before she spoke, and she said the delegation was dead, and all 37 members had been killed, and the Krell sent back their ship with a message saying they did not negotiate with prey animals and they would accept nothing less than complete human withdrawal from the Arcturus sector and payment of war reparations in the form of slave labor. The bridge fell silent and Cole closed his eyes briefly, thinking of Frank Morgan because they had served together decades ago before Cole specialized in military command, and Morgan chose diplomacy, and he had been a good man who believed words could prevent wars, and now he was dead because the Krell did not share that belief. Cole told Novak to send his condolences to the families and inform Earth Command that the Avalanche battle group was ready for deployment, and Novak hesitated and said the assembly was still debating rules of engagement and there was significant opposition to offensive operations. And Cole replied that they had better debate faster, because the Krell just declared war again, and humanity could either bring the fight to the enemy on their terms or wait for the Krell to bring it with overwhelming force. The channel closed and Cole walked to the tactical display studying star charts, and intelligence reports indicated Krell fleet movements in a dozen systems, and they were mobilizing slowly and carefully but inexorably, and the next assault would make New Perth look like a minor skirmish. On New Perth, Captain Jake Morrison had been promoted to station commander overseeing the colony expanded defense network, and the orbital platforms Earth promised were operational now, and bristling with missile tubes and rail guns, and the colony population had swelled with military personnel and their families, and warehouses, once filled with farming equipment, now stored ammunition and spare parts. Lieutenant Kyle Hayes, who was now Morrison executive officer, entered the command center with a data tablet and reported that patrol ships had observed Krell scout vessels at the edge of the system, and they jumped out before interception, but they were definitely scanning human defenses, and Morrison studied the report, knowing this was the third time that month. Morrison said the Krell were probing response times and mapping sensor coverage and conducting textbook pre-invasion reconnaissance, and Hayes asked how long they had, and Morrison replied that if he were planning an assault, he would want at least a year to gather intelligence and build up forces, but the Krell were angry and pride might make them move faster than prudence suggested. Morrison ordered Hayes to evacuate all non-essential civilians quietly without causing panic, but he wanted the most vulnerable people off-world within 30 days, and Hayes nodded grimly and departed, and Morrison returned to the observation window, watching transport ships come and go and thinking about how New Perth had been a peaceful farming colony once, and now it was an armed fortress. Deep in Krell territory, High Commander Velkrin reviewed infiltration reports with growing concern, because his intelligence operatives had established limited surveillance of human space, and what they discovered troubled him deeply, and humanity was not the fragmented, frightened species the initial engagement suggested, and they possessed remarkable organizational capacity and adapted to military necessity with frightening speed. Velkrin told his second-in-command that humans learned fast and too fast, and this species had capacity to become significant threat if given time to develop, and his subordinate replied, they should crush humanity now because they had assembled 3 grand fleets with 1,500 warships total, and even human dreadnoughts could not withstand such numbers. Velkrin conceded perhaps, but asked at what cost, because they lost 200 ships to 1 dreadnought, and how many would they lose to 4, and human intelligence was improving as well, and they would know the Krell were coming, and they would prepare, and the cost could be catastrophic. The debate within Krell leadership grew fierce, with one faction demanding immediate overwhelming assault, and another advocating longer-term strategy of containment and gradual erosion of human resources, and Velkrin found himself increasingly isolated, advocating for the unthinkable, which was coexistence. Velkrin suggested to the Grand Council that they could define territorial boundaries and recognize human sovereignty in their current systems in exchange for non-aggression pact, but the response was predictable outrage, and other commanders shouted that the Krell Dominion did not negotiate with inferior species. Velkrin countered that they would spend the next century bleeding resources to fight an enemy that grew stronger with each engagement, and he asked if pride was worth the survival of the Dominion, but no consensus emerged, and the Krell would continue military buildup while their leadership argued about strategy. 3 months later, the U.S. Maelstrom and U.S. Tempest completed trials and joined the fleet, and Cole now commanded 4 dreadnoughts and supporting elements comprising 43 cruisers and destroyers and frigates, and it was the largest military force humanity had ever assembled. Cole divided his fleet into 3 defensive groups, with the first centered on Thunderchild protecting core systems, including Earth and Mars, and the second led by Avalanche defending mid-range colonies, and the third commanded by newly promoted Admiral Grant aboard Maelstrom, establishing forward presence in Arcturus sector. It was not enough, and Cole knew it with certainty, because 4 dreadnoughts against a 1,000-world empire could not hold forever. But it was what they had, and it would have to suffice, and humanity would make the Krell pay dearly for every system they tried to take. The anticipated Krell assault came 9 months after New Perth, and not the overwhelming force intelligence predicted, but coordinated strikes against 6 human colonies simultaneously, and each strike force consisted of 100 Krell warships, suggesting the Dominion had learned from defeat and now avoided concentrating targets for humanity dreadnoughts. The defense was desperate but successful, and Admiral Grant arrived at Arcturus sector within 4 hours of initial attack, and the Maelstrom mass driver accounted for 37 Krell ships before enemy fleet retreated, and similar results played out across human space, and the Krell achieved some tactical objectives, destroying infrastructure and defensive platforms, but failed to take any colonies, and humanity had survived barely, and the cost was severe, with 8,000 military personnel dead and 23 warships destroyed. 3 days after the battle at New Perth, the United Earth Assembly convened an emergency session, and representatives from 73 colony worlds gathered beneath the mountain fortress in Geneva, and some attended in person, while others appeared as holograms, and the great assembly hall that was normally a place of calm debate now roared with urgent voices and worried questions, because humanity had just learned they were not alone in the galaxy, and their neighbors were hostile. Secretary General Patricia Novak called for order, and her voice carried authority despite her exhaustion, and she introduced Admiral Richard Cole, who had traveled from the Arcturus sector, to brief the assembly on the engagement with the Krell. Dominion and Cole stepped to the central podium in his dress uniform, and he looked older than his 52 years because command aged a person in ways that civilians rarely understood. Cole told the assembly that 72 hours ago, the Krell had attempted to conquer New Perth with 274 warships, and through the sacrifice of the patrol fleet and the intervention of the Thunderchild, they had repelled the attack, and the Krell had lost 198 ships while humanity had lost nobody, and the chamber fell silent at this statement before questions erupted from all sides. Representative Carlos Mendez from Mars stood and asked why the Thunderchild had been built in secret, using resources from dozens of worlds, and his constituents wanted to know why they had funded a weapon they did not know existed, and Cole met his gaze steadily and explained that if the colonists had known, then the Krell would have known, because the Dominion had infiltration assets throughout known space, and the Dreadnought remained effective, because it remained secret until the moment it was needed. Representative Helen Ford from Luna asked what would happen when the Krell returned with 1,000 ships instead of 200, and Cole replied that this was exactly why he had come to Earth, because the Thunderchild was powerful. But it was only one ship, and he could not defend 73 colony worlds simultaneously, and humanity needed to accelerate the Dreadnought program and build at least 6 more vessels to establish a proper defensive perimeter. The assembly chamber erupted again with voices raised in concern and anger, because the resource allocation for 6 dreadnoughts would bankrupt half the colonies, and the Thunderchild alone had consumed 20 years of military budgets. And Novak raised her hand for silence, and Cole waited for the noise to subside before responding. Cole told them the Thunderchild had saved 2 million lives in 30 minutes, and the assembly needed to understand the strategic situation clearly, because the Krell Dominion spanned 400 star systems, and their military consisted of thousands of warships, and what humanity defeated at New Perth was a single expeditionary fleet, and the Krell would return with overwhelming force, and without significant military buildup humanity would lose the coming war. Colonel Amy Carter of Earth Defense Intelligence stood and confirmed that Cole was correct, and their intelligence indicated Krell leadership was currently divided, with one faction advocating immediate retaliation, and another urging caution, and they estimated humanity had 6 months to a year before the Krell acted decisively, and this was the window they had to prepare. Mendez shook his head and said, building 6 dreadnoughts in 1 year was impossible, and they would need to militarize the entire economy and transform colonies built for farming and mining into military production centers. And Cole replied simply that yes, they would need to do exactly that because the alternative was extinction, and the Krell did not negotiate and did not coexist, and they conquered or destroyed, and humanity had demonstrated they could fight, which meant the Krell would now view them as a threat to be eliminated. Back in the Arcturus sector, Captain Jake Morrison stood in the observation deck of New Perth Station watching reconstruction efforts below, and the Krell attack had caused panic, but little actual damage thanks to the Thunderchild intervention. But the psychological impact was profound because humanity now knew they shared the galaxy with hostile powers, and the illusion of safety was shattered. Lieutenant Kyle Hayes joined Morrison at the viewport and reported that the Colony Council was building a memorial for the vigilant crew, and Morrison raised an eyebrow because they had not lost anyone, and Hayes explained the memorial was for the willingness to sacrifice. And the council said it was important for people to remember that freedom required the constant readiness to defend it. Hayes asked if there was word on defensive upgrades, and Morrison told him Earth was sending a battle group with 6 destroyers and 2 cruisers, and they were building orbital defense platforms with heavy weapons, and there was talk of drafting colonists for militia service because the galaxy had changed and New Perth needed to change with it. Morrison said that 3 days ago, most colonists thought space was safe and full of opportunity, but now they knew there were things out here that wanted to kill them. And Hayes asked if it changed anything because people had come to the colonies to build new lives and now they would spend their time preparing for war, and Morrison considered the question carefully. Morrison told Hayes that his grandfather once said freedom and peace were not natural states, but were constructed by constant willingness to defend them, and the colonists came for peace, but now they would have to fight for it, and it was not fair. But life rarely was, and the alternative was surrender or death, and humans did not surrender. Far from human space in the heart of Krell territory, the Grand Council convened and 12 High Commanders surrounded a holographic projection of the Battle of New Perth, and they watched the engagement for the 100th time, and the death of Zarthok and loss of nearly 200 ships demanded response. High Commander Velkrin was eldest of the council, and he gestured at the Thunderchild image and said this vessel represented a fundamental shift in the balance of power, because the humans possessed technology the Krell did not understand. And their Dreadnought moved with impossible agility, and its weapons pierced shields as if they were atmosphere, and its point defense was perfect and flawless. High Commander Takmor growled that they should build larger ships and overwhelm the humans with numbers they could not possibly counter. But Velkrin asked at what cost, because they had lost 200 ships to 1, and how many would they lose to destroy it, and what if the humans had more dreadnoughts hidden somewhere? High Commander Sarnell offered that intelligence suggested only one such vessel existed, but Velkrin replied dryly that intelligence had also suggested the humans were primitive and weak, and their information had proven inadequate. And he proposed a different approach where they studied humanity and infiltrated their society, and learned the extent of their capabilities before committing to total war. Takmor clicked his mandibles in disgust and said, Velkrin proposed patience when the humans had humiliated the Dominion, and every species in the sector had watched Zarthok fleet flee in terror, and if they did not respond with overwhelming force, others would question Krell's strength and the Dominion would appear weak. Velkrin said they would demonstrate strength through intelligence rather than brute force, and he moved that they authorize deep infiltration operations into human space to learn their weaknesses and find their secrets. And then when they struck, it would be with certainty rather than assumptions, and the vote was close, but Velkrin faction prevailed and the Krell would take a measured approach for now. Back on Earth, Admiral Cole sat in his office overlooking Geneva Spaceport, and the Assembly had adjourned without making a decision, which meant weeks more of debate while time ticked away. And he understood their hesitation because Building 6, Dreadnoughts, would transform human society, and colonies focused on farming would become military-industrial complexes, and resources that could improve lives would instead build weapons. But Cole had studied history, and he knew what happened to civilizations that chose comfort over security, and they died usually quickly and often screaming, and he would not let that happen to humanity, even if it meant forcing them to become something they did not want to be. The Krell had perfected warfare over 3,000 years, and they knew how to break enemy formations and crush resistance through overwhelming numbers and psychological terror, and High Commander Zarthok had used these tactics to defeat 17 civilizations, and he saw no reason why the humans would be any different. despite their massive dreadnought, because one ship could not stand against 274 warships no matter how large it was, and he ordered his fleet to concentrate, fire on the human vessel and destroy it quickly, before it could bring its weapons to full power. 140 Krell warships broke formation and accelerated toward the Thunderchild, and their plasma cannons began charging and missile tubes loaded with armor-piercing warheads, and the Krell had destroyed vessels twice as large as their own through coordinated assault and numerical superiority, and Zarthok watched his tactical display with confidence, because the human ship was impressive, but it was still just one target, and his ships would tear it apart with focused fire. Aboard the Thunderchild, Admiral Richard Cole sat in his command chair and watched the Krell fleet approach, and he had been preparing for this moment for 20 years, because he had overseen the construction of this vessel in absolute secrecy, and every system had been tested and retested, and the crew of 200 had trained endlessly for combat against superior numbers, and Cole was calm because he knew exactly what his ship could do, and the Krell were about to learn a very expensive lesson. Commander Vincent Park stood at the weapons station and reported that all primary systems were online, and the point defense grid was active, and the mass driver was charged to 80%, and missile bays were loaded with heavy penetrators, and the ship was ready for combat. And Cole nodded and ordered Lieutenant Danny Morris at helm to initiate evasive pattern Omega-7 and show the Krell that size did not mean slow. The Thunderchild moved, and for a vessel 3 kilometers long, its acceleration was impossible, and the Krell targeting computers suddenly found their target lock slipping away as the Dreadnought twisted and turned with the agility of a ship 1/10 its size, and the secret was the revolutionary gravity drive that Earth engineers had developed, and it treated the ship as if it existed in its own pocket of space-time, and physics worked differently inside that pocket. The Krell fleet fired, and thousands of plasma bolts and missiles converged on the space where the Thunderchild had been, a fraction of a second earlier, but the Dreadnought was already somewhere else, and its point defense systems tracked every incoming projectile with computer precision, and hundreds of automated turrets swiveled and fired in perfect coordination, and missiles detonated before reaching their target, and plasma bolts were intercepted by precisely timed countermeasures, and the Krell assault broke against the Dreadnought defenses like ocean waves against a steel cliff. Cole ordered return fire, and Park activated the primary batteries, and the Thunderchild broadside erupted with light and sound, and railguns sent tungsten penetrators screaming across space at a fraction of light speed, and the rounds hit 3 Krell cruisers simultaneously, and shields flared bright and died, and armor crumpled like paper, and one ship exploded in the expanding ball of superheated gas, and the other 2 tumbled away trailing atmosphere and debris, and spinning out of control. Park fired the missile bays, and 200 missiles launched in a coordinated swarm, and these were not simple explosive warheads but sophisticated weapons with artificial intelligence guidance systems that analyzed enemy defenses in real time and adjusted their approach patterns, and they wove through space in unpredictable spirals and curves that overwhelmed Krell point defense through sheer complexity and coordination. 47 missiles reached their targets, and 31 Krell ships suffered critical damage or complete destruction in 15 seconds. And Zarthok watched his tactical display turn red with destroyed and damaged vessels, and he felt something he had not experienced in decades, and it was fear, because one ship should not be able to do this, and his fleet coordination was breaking down as ships scattered to avoid the Dreadnought withering fire. The Thunderchild moved through the Krell formation like a shark through a school of fish, and every pass left wreckage in its wake, and disabled ships tumbling away, and Cole stood from his command chair and walked to the tactical display and studied the battlefield, and he saw the Krell flagship hanging back behind the main fleet, and he knew that destroying the command vessel would break enemy morale completely. Cole ordered Park to charge the mass driver, and this was the Thunderchild primary weapon and the reason the ship needed its own dedicated reactor core, and along the Dreadnought spine electromagnetic coils began humming with almost incomprehensible power, and a solid block of depleted uranium weighing 40 tons loaded into the firing chamber, and the weapon drew so much energy that lights dimmed throughout the ship. Park reported mass driver charged to 100%, and Morris confirmed target lock on the Eternal Fang, and Cole leaned forward and gave the order to fire, and the universe seemed to hold its breath. The mass driver released its payload with a flash of blue-white light that could be seen from New Perth's surface, and the uranium projectile accelerated to 12% of light speed in 3 seconds, and it crossed the distance to the Eternal Fang in less than a heartbeat, and Zarthok had one moment to see the incoming threat on his display before it hit. The Eternal Fang shields were designed to stop plasma and missiles, but they might as well have been smoke against the mass driver projectile, and the uranium block punched through the forward shields and through 6 decks of armor plating and through the primary reactor core and out the other side, and for a brief moment nothing happened, and then the reactor containment failed catastrophically. The Eternal Fang became a second sun, and the explosion was visible from New Perth, and 17 Krell ships in close formation with the flagship were consumed by the blast, and the shockwave sent dozens more tumbling away, with buckled hulls and failed systems, and the Krell Armada advance stopped completely. What remained of the Krell fleet hung in space, and their flagship was gone, and their high commander was dead, and the human Dreadnought was already turning toward them with weapons hot and ready, and some ships began retreating immediately, while others hesitated between pride and survival. Cole opened a channel on all frequencies, and his voice was calm and measured, and he told the Krell vessels that their commander had given them a chance to withdraw, and he would extend the same courtesy once, and they could leave the system now, or join their flagship, and they had 2 minutes to decide. Captain Morrison watched from the vigilant bridge as the enemy fleet that had seemed unstoppable began to fragment, and ships opened hyperspace windows and fled, and Hayes laughed with relief and disbelief and reported that the Krell were withdrawing, and Morrison allowed himself a smile and ordered continued evacuation operations and requested a direct line to the Thunderchild because he wanted to thank the Admiral personally. Within 3 minutes, every remaining Krell vessel had jumped to hyperspace, and the threat was over, and 2 million colonists on New Perth would live to see another day, and Cole addressed his bridge crew and told them they had done well, but to stay alert because the Krell would return with more ships and better planning, and today they had bought humanity time, and now they needed to use that time wisely and prepare for the larger war that was surely coming. The Krell Dominion had ruled the outer regions of the galaxy for 3,000 years, and their warships were known across hundreds of star systems as instruments of total conquest, and their leader, High Commander Zarthok, sat in his command chair aboard the flagship Eternal Fang, and he reviewed the intelligence reports about a species called humans with something close to amusement, because these creatures had only been traveling through space for less than 100 years, and they built their stations from simple metals, and they communicated using basic electromagnetic waves like children playing with primitive toys, and Zarthok clicked his mandibles together in what passed for laughter among his kind, because the reports showed that the largest human warship was barely 400 meters long, while his own flagship measured over 1,200 meters and carried enough firepower to level a planet, and he had crushed 17 civilizations before this one, and the humans would be no different from the others who had fallen before the might of the Krell. The human colonies in the Arcturus sector were small and poorly defended, with just a handful of patrol ships and some defensive platforms that looked more decorative than functional, and Zarthok had watched the surveillance footage of human trading posts and research stations, and he saw families living there and children playing in the gardens under artificial sunlight, and it made him feel something close to pity, because these soft creatures had no idea what was coming for them, and they had built their lives in space claimed by the Krell Dominion without permission and without tribute, and that meant they would serve as examples to other species who might think about expanding into Krell territory without proper respect. Zarthok called his fleet commanders to the war room, and the holographic display showed 274 Krell warships assembled and ready for the attack, and each commander reported their readiness with pride and confidence because they had never lost a battle, and they had never retreated, and the Krell way was total victory or death, and there was no middle ground, and Zarthok gave them their orders with calm authority, telling them they would jump into the Arcturus sector, near the human colony of New Perth, and they would give the humans 6 hours to evacuate their civilians because the Krell were conquerors but not monsters, and after 6 hours they would begin dismantling the colony piece by piece, and any humans who remained would be taken as labor stock to serve the Dominion in the mining operations on the outer worlds. Captain Jake Morrison commanded the patrol frigate UES Vigilant, and he was drinking his 3rd cup of coffee that morning when the sensors began screaming with alarm signals, and Lieutenant Kyle Hayes at the communications station looked up from his display with eyes wide and face pale, and he reported that multiple contacts were emerging from hyperspace, and the count kept climbing, and Morrison felt his stomach drop because he could see on the tactical screen that 274 hostile vessels had just appeared at the edge of the system, and they were all Krell warships, and the Vigilant was alone out here with just 43 crew members and a ship designed to chase pirates, not fight a war. Morrison ordered general quarters and the alarm klaxons blared through the ship, and crew members ran to their battle stations, and Hayes sent out an emergency beacon toward Earth on all frequencies, and the message was simple and desperate, saying that the Krell Dominion had arrived in force, and New Perth was under threat and they needed help immediately. And Morrison knew that help was weeks away at best, and the colony had 2 million people living there, and most of them were families, and farmers and scientists who had come out here to build new lives away from the crowded inner systems. The Krell broadcast came through on every channel, and Zarthok's voice was cold and mechanical through the translation software, and he told the humans they were trespassing in Krell space, and their colonies would be dismantled, and their ships destroyed, and their people would serve the Dominion as workers, and any resistance would result in the complete destruction of their worlds, and he gave them 6 hours to evacuate civilians. And Morrison listened to the message with growing horror, because he knew 6 hours was not enough time to evacuate 2 million people, and the transport ships would need at least 12 hours to get everyone off-world. Morrison looked at his crew, and they were all watching him and waiting for orders, and he knew what he had to do, even though it meant certain death. And he ordered the helm to set an intercept course toward the Krell fleet, and Hayes looked at him like he had gone insane and asked how one frigate could possibly stop an armada. And Morrison replied that they could not stop them, but they could slow them down and buy time for the civilians to escape. And every minute the Krell spent dealing with the Vigilant was another minute for families to reach the transport ships. 6 other human ships joined the Vigilant, and together they formed a thin defensive line between the Krell and New Perth. And there were 3 frigates and 2 destroyers, and 1 old corvette that should have been retired 5 years ago, and together they faced 274 enemy warships, and the mathematics were simple and horrible. But Morrison opened a channel to all the ships, and told them it had been an honor serving with them, and they would make the Krell pay for every meter of space, and they would make sure the enemy remembered that humans did not surrender, and did not run away. On New Perth, the evacuation began in chaos, and Administrator Chloe Briggs coordinated the effort from the main spaceport, and her voice was hoarse from shouting orders, and transport ships lifted off one after another, packed with frightened families, and crying children and people who had left everything behind except what they could carry. And Briggs gave priority to children and medical cases and told anyone who could hold a weapon to stay behind until the last ship, and she watched another transport climb into the sky on pillars of fire, and she knew they would not get everyone out in time. The Krell fleet advanced slowly and confidently like a great machine of death, and Morrison watched them come on his tactical display, and the distance closed with terrible certainty, and Hayes counted down the time until weapons range, and 5 minutes and 4 minutes and 3 minutes, and the bridge was silent except for the countdown, and Morrison gripped his command chair and thought about his wife Angela back on Earth and his daughter who wanted to join the Space Academy, and he thought about the 2 million people behind him who deserved a chance to live. 2 minutes to weapons range, and then something impossible happened, and every sensor on every human ship screamed at once, and space itself seemed to tear open behind the human defensive line, and a massive hyperspace window materialized, and it was large enough to swallow a small moon. And Hayes stared at his console and reported that a new contact was emerging, and the mass reading was larger than the entire Krell fleet combined, and Morrison felt his heart skip because something huge was coming through. From the tear in reality it emerged, and the UES Thunderchild materialized like an angry god, and the Dreadnought was 3 kilometers of compressed fury and weapon systems, and it dwarfed every vessel in the system, and Morrison had never seen anything like it, and neither had the Krell.